6 submarines, 15 feet long. 4 men crammed into each hull, breathing recycled air, surrounded by cold black water. Their target, a 40,900-ton German battleship wrapped in steel netting, mines, and an entire fjord full of armed patrol boats. On paper, the mission was suicide. The philosophy behind these midget submarines was brutally simple. If you cannot out-armor the enemy, disappear instead. Strip away everything but the essentials, shrink the target to nothing, and slip through defenses built to stop something 100 times your size. That same philosophy would carry 2 of these submarines to the most audacious naval strike of the Second World War. It would also leave most of their crews dead, missing, or drowning in freezing Norwegian water before the operation was over. How do you sink an unsinkable battleship with a submarine barely bigger than a bus? In September 1943, 2 Royal Navy lieutenants named Donald Cameron and Basil Place found out. What they did beneath the German battleship Tirpitz would change naval warfare, and very nearly cost them their lives to prove it. By the summer of 1942, the Royal Navy had a problem money, and heavy bombers couldn't fix. Tirpitz sat tucked into a Norwegian fjord under camouflage netting, ringed by mountains, protected by smoke generators that could blanket the entire anchorage in minutes, and defended by torpedo nets thick enough to stop anything the size of a conventional submarine. Bomber Command had tried and failed. High-altitude raids scattered bombs across empty water. Aerial torpedoes couldn't reach her through the fjord's narrow approach. Every conventional method of attacking a battleship required getting close enough to be seen. And being seen meant being sunk first. The Admiralty needed something the Germans wouldn't be looking for, because nothing like it had ever worked before. The answer came from a retired naval officer named Commander Cromwell Varley, working with the engineering firm Vickers Armstrongs. Varley's idea sounded almost absurd on first hearing. Build a submarine so small it could pass underneath torpedo nets instead of around them, crewed by so few men that losing one was a survivable cost of doing business, and armed with no torpedoes and no deck gun at all. Instead, the craft would carry its weapon externally, in the form of 2 detachable explosive charges bolted to its flanks, to be released directly beneath an enemy hull and detonated on a timer long after the crew had escaped. There was no room for anything else. No armor plating. No redundant systems. A 4-man crew would sit almost shoulder to shoulder in a hull just over 50 feet long and barely 5 feet in diameter, breathing air that had to be scrubbed and recycled for hours at a stretch. This was the philosophy stripped down to its bones: invisibility as armor. If a target could not be reached by force, it would be reached by being too small to matter. Every design decision reinforced it. The X-craft's silhouette was kept low enough to pass for driftwood on the surface, its electric motor run nearly silent underwater. A separate wet and dry chamber let a diver exit mid-mission to cut through anti-submarine netting by hand, opening a path. The submarine itself would then thread through like a needle. Nothing about the boat was built to survive a fight. Everything about it was built to avoid one. The first prototype, designated X3, went into the water in early 1942, and the volunteers who signed up to crew her were mostly in their 20s, drawn from submarine service with little idea what they were training for beyond the word special. Among them were 2 young lieutenants who would come to define the program more than any engineer ever could. Donald Cameron, a quiet, methodical Scot with a reputation for calm under pressure, and Basil Place, a Dartmouth-trained officer with a taste for risk that his instructors alternately admired and worried about. Both men spent the better part of a year training in Scottish locks, learning to navigate blind, to cut nets in freezing water, and to trust a machine that offered them almost nothing in the way of protection if anything went wrong. The principle they were being trained to execute had a name by the time training ended: passive penetration. Not bombarding your way to the target, vanishing your way there instead. It was a philosophy that would carry them further than anyone thought possible, and it was the same philosophy that would leave an almost no margin for error when things inevitably began to go wrong. By early 1943, the target of this new weapon had a name that struck fear into every Allied planner tracking the Arctic convoys: KMS Tirpitz. Sister ship to the Bismarck, Tirpitz displaced 42,900 tons fully loaded, stretched 823 feet from bow to stern, and carried 8 15-inch guns capable of putting a shell through 6 inches of armor plate from 10 miles away. She never needed to fire a shot to be effective. Her mere presence in Norwegian waters forced the Royal Navy to keep battleships tied down in home fleet duty that could otherwise have supported operations elsewhere. And every convoy of American Lend-Lease trucks, tanks, and aircraft bound for the Soviet Union through the Arctic route had to be planned around the possibility that Tirpitz might sortie and annihilated in open water. Winston Churchill himself called her the Beast, and the nickname was less about her guns than about the psychological weight she carried simply by existing. Tirpitz spent most of 1942 and 1943 anchored in fjord, a narrow arm of Norway's Altenfjord, surrounded by steep granite walls that made torpedo bombing runs nearly impossible, and anti-aircraft positions nearly impossible to avoid. Double rows of torpedo netting encircled her hull, hung deep enough to stop any conventional attack from below. Smoke generators lined the shoreline, ready to fill the fjord with an artificial fog bank within minutes of an air raid warning. Guard boats patrolled around the clock. She was, by any conventional measure, unreachable. The Admiralty's requirement for the X-Craft program was set in blunt, specific terms. Get an explosive charge weighing roughly 2 tons directly beneath the hull of a capital ship anchored in a heavily defended fjord, without being detected before the charge could be placed. And do it using a vessel small enough to physically pass beneath or through anti-torpedo netting designed to stop exactly that kind of intrusion. 6 operational X-Craft were built to the finalized design, numbered X5 through X10, each towed across open water by a full-size submarine, since the midget boats lacked the range and crew endurance to make the 600-mile crossing from Scotland to Norway under their own power. Each X-Craft would carry 2 side charges packed with roughly 4,000 pounds of Amatex explosive between them, set on time fuses, to be released on the seabed directly under the target and detonated hours later, long after the crew had withdrawn. Before any of the 6 boats could be trusted with a real target, they had to prove the concept could work at all, and that trial came in the form of an exercise conducted against a Royal Navy battleship, HMS Malaya, moored in a Scottish loch under conditions deliberately built to mimic fjord's defenses. Cameron and Place, along with the other X-Craft commanders, were sent to penetrate the netting undetected and place dummy charges beneath the anchored battleship. It was not a foregone conclusion. Earlier training accidents had already claimed lives. One X-Craft had flooded and sunk during trials with her crew still aboard, and the entire program had come dangerously close to being scrapped, as too dangerous and too unproven to risk on a real operation. But in the exercise against Malaya, the X-Craft did exactly what Varley's design had promised. They slipped through simulated netting undetected, positioned themselves beneath the hull, and attacked, without the battleship's crew ever confirming a submarine had been anywhere near them until the exercise was called. That result was enough. The Admiralty greenlit Operation Source in the summer of 1943, setting a narrow window between September 20th and 25th, when tides, moonlight, and Arctic darkness would align favorably enough to give the mission any chance of success. 6 X-Craft and their towing submarines would leave Loch Cairnbawn in Scotland, cross the North Sea submerged and under tow, and split into 3 attack pairs once inside Norwegian waters. X5, X6, and X7 were assigned to Tirpitz herself. X8 would target the pocket battleship Lutzow. X9 and X10 would go after the battlecruiser Scharnhorst. It was the largest and most ambitious use of midget submarines ever attempted by any navy, built entirely around a design philosophy that had never been tested against a live, fully defended target, and every man climbing into those cramped 4-man hulls understood that the Loch trial against Malaya had proven the theory. It had not proven what would happen when the guns were real. On the night of September 11th, 1943, 6 Royal Navy submarines slipped out of Loch Cairnbawn on Scotland's northwest coast, each one towing a low, dark shape barely visible above the waterline behind it. Thrasher towed X5, Truculent towed 6, Stubborn towed 7, Shaunimh towed Sirtis taut, scepter taut. Inside each X-craft, a three-man passage crew sat through the crossing, men whose job was simply to keep the boat alive during a transit, so that a fresh operational crew could take over once they neared Norway, sparing the fighting crews the exhaustion of a 600-mile tow. It was meant to be the safest part of the entire operation. It very nearly wasn't. The North Sea in September does not forgive small margins. For 9 days, the 6 pairs ran submerged by day and surface by night to recharge batteries and check the tow, dragging the midget submarines through swells that stressed the Manila tow lines connecting them to their mother boats. On the 9th day, catastrophe struck twice. Aboard X9, the tow parted without warning. There was no explosion, no enemy contact. Nothing anyone aboard Sirtis could point to afterward, except a length of frayed rope suddenly going slack in the water. X9 and her three-man passage crew were never seen again. She is presumed to have dived uncontrollably the moment the tow snapped, dragged down by her own weight before anyone inside could react. 3 men were dead, and the operation had not yet reached Norwegian waters. Then came X8. Her passage had already been rough, forced to release one of her 2 explosive side charges early after a leak threatened to flood the compartment holding it. Hours later, the second charge began leaking as well. Her crew jettisoned it too, setting the timer and pulling away as fast as the small boat's electric motor allowed. When the charge detonated, the blast was powerful enough to rock submarines more than 3 miles distant. X8, closer than that, absorbed enough of the shock to spring her hull. By the next day, taking on water she could not control. X8's crew had no choice but to scuttle her and transfer to the towing submarine. Of the 6 X-craft that had left Scotland, 2 were already gone before a single mile of fjord had come into view. The 4 that remained pressed on. On September 20th, in the slipping zones roughly 60 miles from their targets, the operational crews took over from the exhausted passage crews in a transfer conducted on the open, freezing surface of the North Sea. Men climbing between 2 small hulls in darkness. While trying not to be seen by German coastal patrols, Donald Cameron took command of X6. Basil Place took command of X7. Both men had trained for this exact moment for the better part of a year, and both now carried the full weight of what their commanders had promised the Admiralty. That a machine this small could do what heavy bombers and full-size submarines had failed to do for 2 years running. It is worth understanding at this point in the story exactly what was riding on their success. Tirpitz was not simply a German problem. She was an American one. Since 1941, convoys of Lend-Lease aid, tanks, aircraft engines, trucks, and fuel bound for the Soviet Union had been running the gauntlet of the Arctic route from Iceland to Murmansk, and the mere possibility that Tirpitz might sortie from her fjord had already proven catastrophic once. In July 1942, convoy PQ-17 had been ordered to scatter on the mistaken belief that Tirpitz was steaming to intercept it. The German battleship never left port that day. The scattered convoy did not need her to. Without the protection of a massed formation, U-boats and aircraft picked the ships apart one by one, sinking 24 of the 35 merchant vessels and sending thousands of tons of American-built equipment to the bottom of the Barents Sea. Tirpitz had sunk an entire convoy without firing a single shell, purely by existing in a place where she might have been. Every man aboard X6 and 7 that night understood, in some form, that they were not just hunting a battleship. They were trying to end a threat that had already cost American lives and American material without a shot being fired. X-10, meanwhile, was falling apart. Her operational crew, commanded by Lieutenant Ken Hudspeth, discovered a cascading series of mechanical failures almost as soon as they took over the boat. A jammed periscope, a failing gyro compass, and finally a hydroplane malfunction that made precise depth control nearly impossible in the narrow, current-swept approach to Scharnhorst's anchorage. Hudspeth made the call that any of the other commanders might have had to make in his place. He aborted and turned back toward the rendezvous point to reunite with his towing submarine, carrying 2 live explosive charges he had no way to safely dispose of, and a mission he had trained a year to complete but could not. That left 3 boats and 3 targets that had shrunk to 1. X5, X6, and X7 were now the entire operation. Cameron's X6 and Place's X7 pushed on toward fjord under cover of darkness on the night of September 21st into the early hours of the 22nd, threading a route through waters they had only ever studied on reconnaissance photographs and hand-drawn charts, navigating by a dead reckoning, because a periscope raised too often risked exposing their position to shore batteries less than a mile away. Somewhere behind them, in the darkness, X5 under Lieutenant Henty Creer was making the same approach alone. At 1:05 in the morning, disaster nearly claimed X7 before she had even reached the fjord's outer defenses. A loose floating mine, unmoored from some earlier minefield, drifted into her tow line and began sliding down the cable toward the hull. Lieutenant Place, working in the dark on the casing outside the submarine, managed to kick the mine clear before it could make contact. A moment that could have ended the mission for his boat alone, with no warning and no explanation, the way X9 had ended 9 days earlier. It did not. The tow held. The mine drifted away into the black water, and X7 continued toward Norway with her crew's hearts pounding, and her explosive charges still slung beneath her hull. Still meant for a target that by dawn would no longer have any idea they were coming. The same design choices that had carried 3 midget submarines 600 miles across the North Sea now became the very things threatening to kill their crews before they ever reached Tirpitz. A hull built with no margin for redundancy meant that a single jammed periscope or failed gyro compass, the kind of fault a full-size submarine could absorb and route around, was enough to take X10 out of the fight entirely. A crew of 4, chosen specifically because losing them was a cost the Admiralty could accept, meant there was no backup diver, no spare navigator, no second opinion when something went wrong in the dark. The same smallness that had let X8 and X9 vanish from German radar for 9 days had also meant that when their tows failed or their charges leaked, there was no larger vessel nearby to help, no margin of buoyancy to absorb the damage, nothing between the crew and the freezing water, but a hull the thickness of a car door. Inside fjord itself, the defenses the mission planners had studied from reconnaissance photographs turned out to be more formidable than any single photograph could show. The anti-torpedo netting protecting Tirpitz was not one barrier but a layered system, with an outer boom gate that opened periodically to let German patrol boats and supply vessels pass through. On the morning of September 22nd, Cameron's X6 found that gate open, a stroke of pure luck rather than any flaw in the plan, and slipped through in the wake of a small German vessel before the gate swung shut again. Place's X7, approaching separately, was not so fortunate. He found the netting closed and was forced to dive beneath it, scraping along the seabed in near zero visibility, feeling his way past cables and anchor chains that could have snagged the hull, and held it fast until German patrol boats found the trapped submarine in daylight. Political and operational pressure compounded every technical strain the crews were already carrying. The mission's narrow tidal window meant there was no second attempt if this one failed, no reserve fuel, no standby crew, no fallback date until months later, when moonlight and tide conditions would align again. By which point Tirpitz might have moved, been reinforced, or simply put back out to sea beyond the X-craft's reach entirely. Cameron and Place both knew that whatever happened in the next few hours would be the only chance the Admiralty was going to get, and that knowledge pressed down on every decision as hard as the freezing water pressed against the hull. Then, deep inside water they had assumed was theirs alone, X6 struck the seabed and surfaced briefly, breaking the calm surface of the fjord in full view of a German lookout aboard a nearby vessel. For a moment it seemed the entire operation might end there, spotted and reported before either boat had come within striking distance of the battleship. But the German sailor who spotted the strange shape in the water assumed it was nothing more dangerous than a porpoise breaking the surface, an assumption born of exactly the same design logic that had built the X-craft in the first place. Something too small to be a real threat did not register as one. It was, in the truest sense, the philosophy of invisibility working exactly as Commander Varley had intended, buying the crew a few more critical minutes that a larger, more obviously military silhouette would never have earned them, just after 4 in the morning. X6 broke through the last of the outer netting and entered open water inside fjord itself. Close enough now that Cameron could see Tirpitz's silhouette rising against the pale Arctic half-light. A wall of gray steel, nearly the length of 3 football fields, moored broadside to the shore. The plan called for a submerged approach all the way to the hull, but X6's periscope had begun fogging, and her trim was fighting the crew with every foot of progress, forcing Cameron to surface twice more inside the anchorage itself, each time gambling that the same illusion that had fooled the lookout hours earlier would hold. It held. German sentries aboard support vessels anchored nearby glanced at the low shape cutting through the water and saw nothing worth raising an alarm over. At 0705, Cameron brought X6 directly alongside Tirpitz's hull, so close now that the battleship's anti-torpedo bulge scraped against the submarine's casing as he maneuvered beneath her. He released both of his side charges onto the seabed, set the timers, and turned to withdraw. That was the moment his luck ran out. X6 had lost so much trim and buoyancy control during the approach that she broached the surface directly alongside the battleship, in full view of the deck watch above. A German lookout this time did not mistake the shape for a porpoise. Within seconds, small arms fire was hitting the water around the submarine, and a hand grenade splashed down nearby. Cameron had no way to dive, no way to run, and 2 live charges sitting on the bottom directly beneath the ship he was now trapped against. He gave the only order that made sense: scuttle the boat, destroy the charts and code books, and abandon ship directly onto Tirpitz's own deck, climbing out of the flooding submarine and into the hands of the enemy they had just mined. Place's X7 was still fighting her own war a short distance away. She had become entangled in the underwater netting twice more since clearing the outer boom, forced each time to back away, change angle, and try again while the clock on the tidal window kept running. On her third attempt, she found a gap and slipped through into open water just as Cameron's men were being hauled up onto Tirpitz's deck above. Unaware that X6's crew had already been captured, and unaware that the alarm aboard the battleship had now fully sounded, Place brought X7 in beneath the hull and released his own 2 charges at approximately 0722, positioning them roughly amidships, near the ship's main machinery spaces, before turning to withdraw through waters that were now anything but quiet. Escape proved far harder than the approach. X7 struck the anti-torpedo netting almost immediately, and became fouled in it, her propeller and hydroplanes tangled in steel mesh, while machine gun fire raked the surface above and depth charges, dropped almost blindly by German patrol boats, now aware something was in the water, began detonating close enough to stun the crew inside the hull. Place fought the boat free of the netting and only to become entangled a second time minutes later, forced to surface briefly under fire to get a bearing before diving again into water thick with concussion from the depth charges. For nearly an hour, X7 struggled through this gauntlet, her crew taking on water, her air growing foul before finally clearing the last of the netting and beginning what should have been a straightforward run back toward open water. At 0812, the sea itself answered the question of whether either crew had succeeded. A column of water and debris erupted beneath Tirpitz's hull, visible for miles, followed a fraction of a second later by a second detonation. The combined force of roughly 4 tons of Amatex explosive, split across the charges laid by X6 and X7, lifted the 42,900-ton battleship bodily in the water. Men on her deck were thrown off their feet, turbine mountings sheared from their foundations, range-finding equipment shattered, watertight compartments buckled along a significant stretch of her hull below the waterline. Tirpitz did not sink, and she was never meant to. But the ship that had haunted the Arctic convoys for 2 years was now taking on water. Her main armament fire control systems wrecked, her engines silenced, immobilized in her own anchorage without a single torpedo or bomb ever touching her from above the water. X7 did not escape the blast unscathed. The shockwave, traveling through water far more efficiently than through air, slammed into the already damaged submarine and forced her to the surface directly in the middle of a fjord now fully alert and firing at anything that moved. Place made the decision to abandon ship rather than risk his crew going down with a boat that had no chance of diving again. He and one crewman escaped through the hatch and were pulled from the freezing water as prisoners. Two other men aboard, Robert Aitken and Edmund Goddard, did not make it out in time before the flooding submarine went under a final time, and both drowned within sight of the battleship they had just crippled. X-5 never surfaced at all. Whether Lieutenant Henty Creer's boat had already placed her charges before the attack, or was still working toward the hull when the alarm sounded, remains disputed to this day, with surviving German accounts and post-war British analysis reaching different conclusions. What is known is that sometime after 0730, German sailors aboard Tirpitz spotted a periscope in the water and opened fire with the ship's own secondary armament, depressing guns that had never been designed to fire on a target that close and that small. A column of water rose where the periscope had been. X-5 was never seen again, and no trace of her or her three-man crew, Henty Creer, Kirkpatrick, and Barry, was ever recovered from Fjord's waters. By mid-morning on September 22nd, the reckoning had produced three separate human outcomes, each man's fate sealed by decisions made in the space of a few desperate minutes. Donald Cameron and his crew stood as prisoners on the deck of the very ship they had just mined, watching German damage control parties scramble as the vessel listed and settled deeper in the water beneath them, arrested for an attack that had already succeeded before their captors fully understood what had happened. Basil Place, pulled dripping from the fjord along with one surviving crewman, would spend the rest of the war in a German prison camp carrying the knowledge that two of his men had drowned feet from the target they had just destroyed together. And the three men of X-5 simply vanished, swallowed by the same cold water that had shielded every X-craft's approach for the past 11 hours. Their fate confirmed only by an absence, a boat that failed to return and was never found. Aboard Tirpitz herself, the German crew spent the following weeks in a chaos that mirrored the British operation's shown desperate improvisation. Divers went into the water to inspect the hull damage and found it far worse than initial assessment suggested. Turbine bearings had been thrown out of alignment by inches. Auxiliary machinery rooms had flooded outright. The ship that had spent two years as the single greatest threat to Allied convoy operations in the Arctic was now, in the space of a single morning, reduced to a stationary steel hull incapable of generating more than a few knots of speed, even if she had been ordered to sea. Her main fire control systems requiring a level of repair that no facility in occupied Norway could provide. 9 British sailors were killed across the 3 attacking boats, and 6 more, Cameron, Place, and 4 of their crewmen, survived the mission only to spend the remainder of the war as prisoners. German casualties aboard Tirpitz herself were remarkably light given the scale of the explosion, since both charges had detonated beneath the hull, rather than on the deck where crew were stationed, sparing the direct loss of life even as it crippled the ship's ability to fight or even move. It was, in the final accounting, a mission where the machine's philosophy of smallness and invisibility had worked exactly as Commander Varley designed it to. Carrying 2 crews close enough to strike a blow no bomber squadron had managed in 2 years of trying. It was also a mission where that same philosophy, the total absence of margin, of armor, of any fallback if a single mechanism failed, or a single net proved thicker than expected, had cost 3 men their lives outright, and consigned 6 others to years behind barbed wire. The beast of the fjord had been struck down at last, by something small enough that no one had ever thought to build a real defense against it. The damage inflicted that morning kept Tirpitz out of the war for 6 months, a stretch of time during which the ship that had once forced the Royal Navy to keep battleships tied down in home waters simply sat in Fjord under repair, incapable of threatening a single Arctic convoy. German engineers worked through the Norwegian winter to replace turbine mountings, realign shafts, and rebuild fire control systems that had been shattered by a blast delivered from 4 men in a hull the size of a delivery truck. By the time Tirpitz was seaworthy again in the spring of 1944, the strategic picture in the Atlantic and Arctic had shifted decisively against Germany, and the battleship that re-emerged from repairs was already, in every sense that mattered, a ship running out of time. The Royal Navy did not let her rest. Carrier-based air raids through the summer of 1944 chipped away at what Operation Source had started, and in November of that year, RAF Lancaster bombers carrying tall-boy earthquake bombs, weapons designed specifically to penetrate armored decks that conventional bombs simply bounced off. Finally caught Tirpitz at anchor near Tromsø with no fighter cover to intercept them. She capsized within minutes, taking more than 900 of her crew down with her. The ship that had haunted Allied planning for 2 years was gone, but it is worth noting what made that final strike possible in the first place. Before Operation Source, Tirpitz had been fast enough and seaworthy enough to threaten a sudden sortie against any convoy in range. After it, she never regained full operational readiness, spending her final year as a stationary target rather than a mobile threat, anchored closer to shore specifically because her engines could no longer be trusted for open water operations. The X-craft attack did not sink the beast of the fjord. It broke her legs and made sure she never ran again. For Cameron and Place, the war's end brought a recognition that acknowledged just how far outside ordinary naval combat their mission had fallen. Both men were awarded the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest award for gallantry, presented not for a single act of courage in the heat of a firefight, but for the totality of a mission that had asked them to spend 11 hours navigating a 50-foot submarine through minefields, netting, and an enemy fjord with almost no chance of survival built into the plan from the start. Robert Aitken, the diver aboard X-7 who survived the netting, the depth charges, and the loss of 2 crewmates in the water beside him, received the Distinguished Service Order. The recognition came slowly and quietly, the way most of Operation Source's story did, overshadowed in the public imagination by the larger air and sea battles unfolding elsewhere in 1943 and 1944, even as naval planners on both sides of the Atlantic studied exactly what 4 men in a 15-foot diameter hull had managed to accomplish. The X-craft program itself did not end with Operation Source. Later variants saw service in the Pacific Theater, most notably in a 1945 raid that used a similar midget submarine to cut undersea communication cables off Hong Kong and Singapore, applying the same core philosophy of smallness and stealth to an entirely different kind of target. But the design's deeper legacy runs through the post-war decades, in a way that has less to do with any single follow-on vessel and more to do with an idea, the concept that a submarine's usefulness did not have to scale with its size, that a small enough craft could reach places no full-sized vessel ever could, informed midget submarine and diver delivery programs developed by multiple navies in the years that followed, including the United States Navy's own SEAL delivery vehicle program, built decades later around the same basic premise Commander Varley had pursued in 1942. Invisibility, not armor, as the ultimate defense. Very little of the physical hardware from that September morning survives intact today. X-7, the boat that fought through netting twice and lost 2 of her crew in the final escape, was recovered from Fjord after the war, and now sits on permanent display at the Royal Navy Submarine Museum in Gosport, England, her hull still bearing the compact, almost an improvised look of a weapon built in desperate wartime haste. X-6 was salvaged and eventually broken up, though sections of X-craft equipment and documentation remain preserved across several British naval museums. X-5, along with the 3 men who rowed her into Fjord and never came back out, has never been found, her exact resting place inside the fjord remaining one of the operation's unresolved questions more than 80 years later. The historical verdict on Operation Source has settled, with time, into something more nuanced than the straightforward triumph it might first appear to be. Tactically, the mission was a partial success bought at a steep price. 2 of 6 boats reached their target. 1 of 3 attacking submarines was lost with all hands, and 9 men died to achieve a result that disabled rather than destroyed the ship they had been sent to stop. Strategically, though, disabling Tirpitz for half a year at the exact moment the Allies needed the Arctic convoy route secured proved to be exactly the outcome British planners required, freeing warships for other duties, and closing off the last credible threat of a German surface raider loose among convoys carrying American aid to the Eastern Front. The engineering was vindicated even where individual outcomes were tragic. A machine built entirely around the idea that smallness could the substitute for strength had done what 2 years of heavy bombers, submarines, and destroyers could not. and it had done so by embracing rather than avoiding its own fundamental fragility. Tirpitz was a masterpiece of scale. 8 15-inch guns, 300 million pounds of steel, and a shadow long enough to pin down an entire fleet without ever leaving port. The X-craft was a masterpiece of subtraction. No armor, no deck gun, 4 men in a hull barely large enough to stand up in, built on the belief that the smallest possible target was also the hardest one to stop. Both philosophies worked exactly as their designers intended, right up until the moment they didn't. Tirpitz's mass made her nearly impossible to sink, and just as impossible to move quickly, hide, or repair once her legs were broken. The X-craft's smallness got 2 boats past nets and mines that would have destroyed anything larger, and the same absence of margin that made that possible left no room for error. When a tow line frayed, a periscope fogged, or a mine drifted into a tow line in the dark, one philosophy built a monster too heavy to run. The other built a weapon too fragile to guarantee its own survival. Neither flaw was a design failure. Each was simply the other half of the same virtue, arriving late. 4 men in each hull, 15 feet of steel between them and the North Sea. 2 of those hulls made it under the beast of the fjord, and the war in the Arctic was never quite the same again.